Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The sun had barely risen when Sarah slipped into our room, packing her suitcase with a precision that spoke volumes. I pretended to sleep, listening to the quiet zips and clicks of the latches. She moved quickly, not wanting to disturb me, though it was likely more a courtesy to her own conscience than any real consideration for my rest. After all, if I were truly asleep, I wouldn't see her going through this little ritual, one that had become routine over the last year. When I heard the front door close behind her, I opened my eyes to the empty space where she'd been. The sheets were cold, as they always were after these early departures. I glanced at the clock, 6:15. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, my mind awash in familiar questions, my stomach in a knot that had become all too familiar. I wanted to believe it was work, wanted to cling to the stories she had been feeding me for months. But deep down, I knew better. Over the past year, Sarah's work had become more demanding, or so she claimed. Long nights at the office, weekends spent at conferences, and emergency meetings that couldn't wait. At first, I'd been supportive, proud even. She had a strong work ethic, and I'd always admired her ambition. But when her explanations grew thinner and her stories more convoluted, I began to suspect that her dedication was more than professional. My suspicions hardened one night when she came home after a supposed business dinner, smelling like someone else's cologne. She brushed it off, claimed she'd hugged a colleague goodbye. I wanted to believe her, to let her lie become my truth. But the doubts lingered, gnawing away at me, making it impossible to ignore the signs that had been piling up like a wall between us. And yet, each time I tried to broach the subject, she would laugh, call me paranoid, or insist I was just stressed from work. I worked from home, managing my consulting business, so our lives often felt like two separate worlds. She left early, came back late, and I was here, with only my doubts to keep me company. I wanted to trust her, to let it go. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Today, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I waited until I was certain she was gone, and then I went to her side of the closet, to her drawer of work essentials that she kept just out of sight. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, to dispel these thoughts that had taken root in my mind. But what I found only confirmed my worst fears. Tucked beneath a pile of receipts and paperwork was a thin folder, marked with the name Ryan. My hand trembled as I opened it, revealing printed emails and messages, each one a dagger to the heart. The words were casual yet intimate, revealing a side of Sarah I'd never seen, a side she'd kept hidden from me for months. The messages spoke of longing, stolen moments, and secret meetings. They mentioned trips, restaurants, hotel rooms. I felt a surge of nausea as I pieced together the timeline, matching her business trips with dates mentioned in the messages. It was all there, laid bare in her words and his replies, a trail of betrayal that cut through the life we'd built together. I slammed the folder shut, anger and despair bubbling up inside me. Every word I'd read felt like a punch to the gut, each revelation another blow to my dignity. I tried to calm myself, to gather my thoughts, but all I could feel was a sickening mixture of rage and heartbreak. How could she do this? How could she look me in the eyes every day and pretend that nothing was wrong? I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but a part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done, and nothing she could say would undo the betrayal. I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. But one thing was certain, I couldn't keep living like this, pretending that everything was okay when it was anything but. That night, I lay awake in our bed, alone with my thoughts. The weight of the betrayal pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. I thought about the life we'd built together, the promises we'd made, and the years we'd spent side by side. It all felt hollow now, a facade that had crumbled in the face of the truth. As the hours dragged on, I made a decision. I wouldn't let her lies dictate my life any longer. I would confront her, but on my terms, in my own time. She would have to face the consequences of her actions, and I would be there to watch her world come crashing down. When Sarah returned from her business trip, she found her belongings neatly packed by the door. I was waiting for her, calm and collected, the evidence of her betrayal laid out in plain sight. She looked at me, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock, but I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace, a calmness that came from knowing that I had taken control of my own life, that I was no longer a prisoner to her lies. I watched as she struggled to find the words, as the weight of her deceit settled over her like a shroud. As she stammered out excuses, I held up a hand, silencing her. I didn't need her lies or her apologies. I had all the answers I needed, and the strength to move forward without her. When Sarah stood there, caught off guard by the sight of her things packed by the door, I saw her facade begin to crumble. The shock in her eyes quickly shifted to something else, panic, desperation maybe, but I felt no sympathy. In the silence that followed, her gaze flicked between me and the neatly packed bags. She seemed to understand, in some small way, that the game was over, that her carefully woven web of lies had finally unraveled. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. What's all this? Her hand rested on the handle of her suitcase as though she could somehow will everything back to normal, to keep herself rooted here in our home. I looked at her, my voice steady and cold. It's time for you to leave, Sarah. I know everything. She froze, her mouth opening and closing as though she were searching for the right words, a way to spin it, some explanation that might lessen the weight of her betrayal. I could see her mind racing, trying to gauge exactly how much I knew, how deep the deception had gone. But I was tired of her games. I turned and walked into the living room, where I had laid out the evidence on the coffee table, the emails, the hotel receipts, even a photo I had found of her and Ryan at a restaurant. I had gone to great lengths to gather everything I needed, making sure there was no room for denial, no possible way for her to twist her way out of this. She followed me into the room, her steps hesitant, as if each one brought her closer to some impending doom. I gestured toward the table. Why don't you take a look at what I've found? She stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached for the top email, her eyes scanning the words. I watched as the color drained from her face, her fingers clutching the edge of the paper as though it were a lifeline. I could almost feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of her actions finally pressing down. David, please, she whispered, looking up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I let out a bitter laugh. You didn't mean for this to happen? That's the best you can come up with? My voice echoed in the room, sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. You didn't accidentally meet him, Sarah. You didn't accidentally send him emails or book hotel rooms. These are choices you made. Deliberate choices. Don't stand here and tell me it was a mistake. She took a step toward me, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled away. I didn't want her touch, didn't want the empty reassurances she was no doubt about to offer. Her words, her gestures, they all felt hollow now, stripped of any meaning or sincerity. David, please, she said again, her voice breaking. I know I messed up. I know I've hurt you. But I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. I stared at her, disbelief mingling with a fresh surge of anger. Fix this? I shook my head, incredulous. You think this is something that can just be fixed? You think a few apologies and promises will somehow erase all of this? Her tears were falling freely now, her shoulders slumping as the weight of her actions seemed to finally settle upon her. I know I don't deserve it, she said, her voice barely audible. But I'm begging you, please, give me another chance. Let me prove to you that I can change. I laughed again, a hollow sound that echoed in the emptiness between us. Do you really think I can trust you? After everything you've done? You've been lying to me for months, maybe even years. How am I supposed to believe a single word that comes out of your mouth? For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw a flash of something else in her eyes, something hard, unyielding. I realized then that she wasn't just pleading for forgiveness. She was desperate to hold on to the life she'd built, to keep the security and comfort that our marriage had afforded her. Perhaps she thought she could talk her way out of this, manipulate me the way she'd done so many times before. But I was done playing the fool. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady and cold, "there's nothing left for you here. I'm done. We're done." She stared at me, her face a mixture of horror and disbelief. "You can't just throw everything away like this," she whispered, almost to herself. "We have a life together. A home. Memories." Memories? I cut her off, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "You mean the life you've been pretending to live while you were sneaking off with someone else? Don't talk to me about memories, Sarah. Don't try to make this about something noble or tragic. You lied to me, and now you're facing the consequences." She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting together as if she could somehow wring out the guilt that was pouring over her. "Please, David," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We can get through this. We can go to counseling, work on rebuilding trust." I shook my head, cutting her off. "This isn't something you can just patch up with therapy, Sarah. This isn't some small issue we can work through. You destroyed everything we had, and there's no going back." I could see the realization dawning in her eyes, the truth settling over her like a heavy fog. She wasn't going to talk her way out of this. The life she had built, the lies she had carefully crafted, they were all crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She let out a choked sob, her hands covering her face as she sank onto the couch. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. "I'm so sorry." I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of detachment as I took in the sight of her, broken and defeated. Part of me wanted to reach out, to offer some form of comfort, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The pain she had caused was too fresh, too raw. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. After a long silence, I turned and walked toward the door, feeling the weight of her gaze on my back. I paused, glancing over my shoulder to take one last look at the woman I had once loved, the woman who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. "Goodbye, Sarah," I said quietly, my voice filled with finality. And with that, I left her there, in the ruins of the life we had built together, knowing that there was no turning back. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud, and I stood there on the front step, inhaling the crisp evening air as if it could somehow cleanse me of everything I'd just experienced. The street was quiet, the neighborhood peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just erupted inside. I could still hear the echoes of Sarah's voice, pleading, bargaining, desperate to cling to the life that had been ripped away from her own deception. I walked to the edge of the driveway and leaned against the hood of my car, staring up at the clear night sky. The stars blinked down, indifferent to the turmoil swirling inside me. Part of me felt hollow, empty, like I'd left a piece of myself behind in that house. But another part, a part that had been dormant for too long, felt free. Free from the lies, the pretense, the weight of trying to hold together something that had already fallen apart. As the minutes passed, the chill in the air seeped into my bones, grounding me, pulling me back to reality. I needed to figure out my next steps. My mind drifted to practicalities, the house, the finances, the inevitable mess that lay ahead. But I couldn't face any of that right now. Not tonight. I got into my car and drove aimlessly, letting the roads carry me as the city lights blurred past. Eventually, I found myself on a quiet stretch of road by the coast, the ocean stretching out dark and vast beside me. I parked the car and stepped out, drawn to the steady rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore. There was something calming about it, something timeless and unwavering, a reminder that life would go on, no matter how shattered it felt in this moment. I sat on a large rock near the water, letting the cold wind whip across my face as I stared out at the horizon. My thoughts drifted back to the years I'd spent with Sarah, the moments that now felt tainted, hollowed out by the knowledge of her betrayal. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly happy, truly at peace in my own life. The memory was elusive, slipping through my fingers like sand. For so long, I'd let her lies shape my reality, let her needs and desires dictate the terms of our life together. I'd been so wrapped up in making her happy, in preserving the illusion of our marriage, that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I'd lost along the way. A soft voice broke the silence. "Rough night?" Startled, I looked up to see an older man standing a few feet away, his weathered face creased with lines, his eyes kind and knowing. He was holding a fishing rod, the tip bending slightly in the breeze as he watched me with a mixture of curiosity and understanding. "You could say that," I replied, managing a weak smile. He nodded, settling onto a nearby rock. "I've been fishing this stretch of coast for 50 years. Seen a lot of people come and go, all kinds of folks dealing with all kinds of troubles. You're not the first person to sit out here looking like the weight of the world's on your shoulders." I chuckled softly. "Guess I'm not as original as I thought." He gave me a knowing smile. "None of us are. Life has a way of throwing the same problems at us, just dressed up in different clothes." We sat in silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the spaces between us. I felt an odd sense of comfort in his presence, as though I were sitting with an old friend rather than a stranger on a dark, deserted beach. Finally, he spoke again. "Sometimes, when things fall apart, it's the world's way of telling you it's time for something new." I glanced over at him, surprised by the insight in his words. "How do you let go of something you thought was your whole life?" The man shrugged, casting his line out into the water. "By realizing that it was never really yours to begin with. We spend our lives clinging to things, thinking they're ours to keep. But the truth is, nothing in this life is permanent. Not people, not places, not even love. The only thing we truly own is ourselves." His words sank in, resonating in a way that felt almost unsettling. I'd spent so much of my life trying to hold on to Sarah, trying to make her happy, trying to be the husband she wanted. But in the process, I'd lost sight of who I was, of what I wanted, of the things that truly mattered to me. I watched as he reeled in his line, his movements steady and practiced, as if he'd done this 1,000 times. "So what do I do now?" I asked, half to myself. He looked over at me, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You start over. You find out who you are without her, without the lies. You figure out what makes you happy, what gives your life meaning. And you don't look back." His words lingered in the air, a quiet challenge, a call to action. I nodded slowly, a sense of resolve settling over me. I didn't have all the answers, didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild, find a new path forward. As the old man stood to leave, he tipped his hat in a small gesture of farewell. "Take care of yourself, son. Life's too short to spend it tied to things that only bring you pain." With that, he walked off, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet rhythm of the waves. I sat there a while longer, letting the cold seep into my bones, grounding me in the present, in this strange new reality I was about to step into. Eventually, I rose, feeling lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't stay in the past any longer. The drive home was calm, my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. When I walked through the door, the silence of the house felt different. It was no longer a reminder of what had been lost but a blank canvas, a space waiting to be filled with new memories, new experiences. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the process of moving on. I focused on my work, poured my energy into the things I loved, the passions I'd neglected. I reached out to old friends, reconnected with people I'd let slip away during the years I'd spent trying to hold together a crumbling marriage. There were days when the weight of it all would hit me again, when the memories would creep back in, and the pain would resurface. But each time, I found it a little easier to let go, to remind myself that I was building something new, something stronger, something that was truly mine. One day, as I was sorting through old boxes, I came across a photo of Sarah and me from years ago, back when things had felt simple, back when I still believed in the life we were building together. I looked at the photo for a long time, feeling a pang of sadness for the man I'd been, for the life that had slipped away. But then I placed the photo back in the box, closed the lid, and put it in the back of the closet. I didn't need the reminders anymore. I was ready to let go, ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that I would be okay, that I could rebuild, start over, and find happiness on my own terms. In the stillness of that moment, I realized that I had finally come full circle, that I had found my way back to myself. And as I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of my old life, I felt a quiet strength rising within me, a promise to myself that I would never again settle for less than I deserved. A few months had passed since the night I confronted Sarah. Life had settled into a new rhythm, one that, surprisingly, felt more stable and satisfying than the years I'd spent clinging to a marriage built on lies. I'd taken up hiking, something I used to love before I became so consumed with work and with keeping Sarah happy. And I'd reconnected with old friends, laughing more freely, seeing the world in ways that I hadn't allowed myself to for a long time. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I decided to treat myself to dinner at a new Italian restaurant in town. As I stepped inside, the warm smell of garlic and fresh herbs greeted me, a reminder that small pleasures could be savored, even in a life that had taken such an unexpected turn. I was halfway through my meal when I felt a soft tap on my shoulder. Startled, I looked up, expecting to see the waiter with my drink refill. But it wasn't the waiter. It was Sarah. She looked different. There was a weariness in her eyes, her frame thinner than I remembered, as though the past months had worn her down, stripped her of the polished, carefree facade she'd always projected. She looked nervous, unsure, a far cry from the woman who'd stood in our living room, pleading for another chance. "David," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I know I don't have any right to be here, to ask for anything. But I need to talk to you. Please. Just a few minutes." I looked at her, the memories flooding back, mixing with the anger and hurt I thought I'd left behind. But something in her expression held me there. She was haunted, somehow, different. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to hear what she had to say. "Fine," I said, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Go ahead." She sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. For a moment, she just looked at me, as though trying to gather the courage to speak. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she began, her voice trembling. "I know that. I betrayed you, lied to you, hurt you in ways I can't even begin to apologize for. But, I came here because I need to tell you the truth." I raised an eyebrow, skepticism seeping into my voice. "The truth? I think I already know it, Sarah." She shook her head, her eyes filled with a sorrow I hadn't seen before. "No, David, you don't. The truth is, my affair with Ryan, it wasn't just an affair. It was a setup." I stared at her, the words not fully registering. "A setup? What are you talking about?" Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to the table. "Ryan works for my father. He approached me one day with an offer, something that seemed crazy, but I was, at a point in my life where I felt trapped, suffocated. My father and Ryan knew I was unhappy, that I wanted something different. They offered me a way out. But there was a condition." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, the guilt stark and unfiltered. "They wanted to use me to get to you." Confusion and anger twisted in my chest. What do you mean, get to me? Who exactly are you talking about? She swallowed, her face pale. Your business. Your clients. My father saw you as competition, and Ryan convinced me to keep tabs on you, on your projects, your clients. At first, I told myself it was harmless. That it wouldn't hurt you. But it didn't stop there. Ryan wanted more, and my father pushed me to go along with it. To make sure you'd be too distracted, too hurt to keep your focus. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd known her father was powerful, ruthless even, but I'd never thought he'd go to such lengths. And Ryan, I thought he'd been nothing more than a passing fling, a poor choice in a moment of weakness. But this was something else, something darker and calculated. You did this to sabotage me. To destroy my career. My voice was low, barely controlled. For him. She shook her head, tears welling up. At first, yes. But I never expected it to go this far. I didn't think I'd fall for Ryan, didn't think I'd hurt you the way I did. But I did, David. And I regret it more than you can know. A bitter laugh escaped me. So now you feel sorry. Now that you've lost everything. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it over mine. I know you can't forgive me. I wouldn't expect you to. But I wanted to tell you the truth, to let you know that you're not crazy, that there was a reason for all of this. My father wanted to ruin you, and I let myself be the weapon he used. I stared at her hand, feeling a cold, detached fury building inside me. I had given her everything, and she had used it against me. Betrayed me for some twisted plot, some vendetta her father had nursed against me. But as the anger simmered, something else took its place, a strange, chilling calm. Thank you for telling me, I said, my voice steady, controlled. But it doesn't change anything. You made your choice, Sarah. And now, you'll live with the consequences. I stood up, pulling a few bills from my wallet and placing them on the table. Goodbye, Sarah. I hope whatever you gain from this was worth it. Without another glance, I walked out of the restaurant, leaving her sitting there, the weight of her choices settling over her like a shroud. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt free. The truth had come out, but it hadn't crushed me as I'd feared. Instead, it had set me free, leaving me with a clear path forward, unburdened by the lies and deceit that had once weighed me down. As I walked to my car, I thought about the life I was building for myself, the choices I would make from here on out. And in that moment, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I would face it on my own terms, with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I drove away, leaving the past behind, ready to embrace the future with open eyes and an unshakable resolve.